Last night he'd finally finished the work, but it had been too late to do anything more, so he'd reluctantly gone home. Today, he'd been too excited to concentrate at school. All he could think about was coming up here, ducking through the hole, going down to the loch and taking some fish from under the new laird's nose. He smiled as he made his way into the hole and pushed aside the old piece of sacking that he'd used to cover the entrance at the other end. His tackle bag and knapsack he easily pulled through the tunnel behind him, but his father's rod, even when broken down into 3 sections, was too long to fit through, so he went back, took it out of its case, and slotted the pieces one by one through the fence. 5 minutes later, his rod in one hand, his tackle bag in the other, he was darting between the rocks down towards the water. Before he died, his father had described Loch SilverFin to him many times. He'd often come up here as a lad to fish, and it was his stories that had inspired the boy. His father had loved fishing, but he'd been wounded by a shell blast in the Great War of 1914, and the pieces of shrapnel buried in his flesh had slowly ruined his health, so that by the end he could barely walk, let alone hold a fishing rod. The boy was excited. He was the man of the house now. He pictured the look on his mother's face when he brought home a fine, fresh trout, but there was more to it than that. Fishing is a challenge, and this was the biggest challenge of all. Loch SilverFin was shaped like a huge fish, long and narrow, and fanning out into a rough tail at this end. It was named after a giant salmon from Scottish folklore, Itairgid, which in Gaelic meant silverfin. SilverFin was a fearsome salmon who was bigger and stronger than all the other salmon in Scotland. The giant, Cacruda, had tried to catch him, and after an epic battle lasting 20 days, the fish had at last swallowed the giant and kept him in his belly for a year before spitting him out in Ireland. Legend had it that SilverFin still lived in the loch, deep in its dark waters. The boy didn't quite believe that, but he did believe that there were some mighty fish here. The loch looked wilder than he'd imagined it. Steep, sheer rocks bordered most of the shore beneath the mountain, and a few stunted rushes were all that grew there. Way down at the other end, partially shrouded in the mist rising off the water, he could just make out the square grey shape of the castle sitting on the little island that formed the eye of the fish. But it was too far away, and the light was too bad for anyone to see him from there. He scouted along the shingle for a good place to cast, but it wasn't very encouraging. The shoreline was too exposed. If any of the estate workers came anywhere near, they'd be bound to spot him. The thought of the estate workers made him glance around uneasily, and he realised how scared he was. They weren't local men, and they didn't mix with the folk in the village. They lived up here in a group of low, ugly concrete sheds the laird had built near the gatehouse. He turned his castle into a fortress, and these men were his private army. The boy had no desire to bump into any of them this evening. He was just thinking that he might have to chuck it in and go home when he saw the perfect spot. At the tip of the fish's tail there was a fold in the edge of the loch where a stream entered. The water here was almost completely hidden from view by the high cliffs all round. He knew that the trout would wait here for food to wash down the stream. 20 feet or so out in the lake there stood a single huge granite rock. If he could get out there and shelter behind it, he could easily cast towards the stream without being seen by either man or fish. He sat in the grass to pull his waterproof waders on. It had been a real slog lugging them up here, but he needed them now. They slipped over his clothes like a huge pair of trousers attached to a pair of boots, coming right up to his chest, where they were supported by shoulder straps. They smelt of damp and old rubber. He fastened his reel to his cane rod and quickly threaded the line through the loops. He'd already tied on his fly line, so he took out his favourite fly, a silver doctor, and knotted it to the end. He skirted round the water's edge until he was level with the big rock, and then waded out into the water towards it. It took him a few minutes to pick his way across, feeling with his feet for safe places to step. The bottom of the loch was slippery and uneven, and at one point he had to make a long detour around a particularly deep area. But once he'd neared the rock, it became shallower again, and he grew more confident. He found a good solid place to stand, and from here he had a clear cast over towards the stream. He checked his fly, played out his line, then, with a quick backwards jerk of his arm, he whipped it up into a big loop behind him, before flicking it forward, where it snaked out across the water and landed expertly at the edge of the loch. That part had gone very well. But it turned out to be the only part that did. He didn't get a single touch. Try as he might, he couldn't attract any fish onto his hook. He cast and recast, he changed his fly, he tried nearer and further. Nothing. It was getting darker by the minute, and he would have to head for home soon, so, in desperation, he decided to try a worm. He'd brought a box of them with him just in case. He dug it out of his pocket, chose a nice fat lobworm, and speared it onto a hook, where it wriggled enticingly. What fish could resist that? He had to be more careful casting the worm, and he flicked it gently, underarm, away from him. Then he got his first bite so quickly it took him completely by surprise. The worm had scarcely landed in the water before he felt a strong tug. He tugged back to get a good hold in the fish's mouth, then prepared for a fight. Whatever it was on the end of his line, it was tough. He pulled it this way and that, furiously, and he watched his rod bow and dip towards the water. He let the fish run for a few moments to tire it, then slowly reeled it in. Still it zigzagged about in the water in a frantic attempt to get free. The boy grinned from ear to ear. It was a big one and wasn't going to give up easily. Maybe he'd caught the awesome SilverFin himself. For some time he played it, gradually reeling in as much line as he dared, praying that the hook wouldn't slip or the line snap. This was a very delicate business. He had to feel the fish, had to try and predict its wild movements. Then, at last, he had it near. He could see something moving in the water on the end of his line. He took a deep breath, hauled it up, and his heart sank. It wasn't SilverFin. It was an eel. And even as he realised it, something brushed against his legs, nearly knocking him off balance. He looked down and saw a second eel darting away through the water. Well, there was nothing else to do. He had to land the thing to retrieve his hook and line. He hoisted it out of the water and tried to grab hold of it, but it was thrashing about in the air, twisting itself into knots, snarling itself round the line, and as he reached for it, it tangled round his arm. It was a monstrous thing. It must have been at least 2 feet long, streaked with slime, cold and sleek and brownish grey. He hated eels. He tried to pull it off his arm, but it was tremendously powerful and single-minded, like one big writhing muscle, and it simply twisted itself round his other arm. He swore and shook it, nearly losing his footing. He told himself to keep calm, and he carefully moved closer to the rock, which he managed to slap the eel against and pin it down. Still it squirmed and writhed like a mad thing. Even though its face showed nothing, it was a cold, dead mask, flattened and wide, with small, dark eyes. Finally he was able to hold its head still enough to get a grip on the deeply embedded hook, and he began to twist and wrench it free. It was hard work. He'd used a big hook, and the end of it was barbed to stop it from slipping out once it had stuck into the fish's mouth. "Come on," he muttered, grunting with the effort, and then, he wasn't sure how it happened, it went too fast. All at the same time, the hook came loose, the eel gave a frantic jerk, and the next thing he knew, the hook was in his thumb. The pain was awful, a freezing bolt shooting all the way up his arm. He gasped and clamped his teeth together and managed not to shout. It was a still evening, and any sound up here would travel for miles, bouncing off the high rocks and water. The eel slithered away and plopped back into the water. A wave of sickness passed over the boy, and he swayed, nearly fainting. For a long while he couldn't bring himself to look at his hand, but at last he forced his eyes down. The hook had gone in by his palm and right through the fleshy base of his thumb, where it stuck out on the other side. There was a horrible gash and flap of skin where the barb had broken through on its way out. Blood was already oozing from the wound and dripping into the icy water. He was lucky that the point had come out and not stayed sunk deep inside his flesh, but he knew that he couldn't just pull the hook free. It had the curved barb on one end and a ring on the other where the line was attached. There was only one thing to do. He rested his rod against the rock, and with his other hand he reached into his tackle bag and got out his cutters. He took a deep breath, clamped the cutters on the end of the hook where the line was knotted, pressed them together, and snack! The end broke off. Then, quickly, so that he didn't have time to think about it, he pulled the hook out by the barb. The fresh pain hit him, and he leant against the rock to stop his knees from giving way. He knew he wouldn't do any more fishing today. He started to cry. All that effort for this. A lousy...